We're so thrilled to have our second panel here. My name is Patriek Karayil. I'm with the MAHA Institute as the Director of Government Relations. I'm a former ARPA-H within HHS and a former White House Presidential Innovation Fellow. I had the unique privilege of engaging with the Presidential Transition Team on a subcommittee and helped write the HHS 100-day plan for Secretary Kennedy. What's really interesting is during my time in the government, you often hear the term that follow the science or let science be the way. But what we've heard this morning, the reality around it. In the puristic way, sure, science has the peer reviews, the replication, the disclosures, but in reality, it's the opposite. It's about retracted papers, the selective use of data, it's academic gatekeeping, but yet science only progresses if we allow for that dissent and disagreement. So to speak about this in depth on this ideological compliance, these weaponized retractions and these conflict of interest, we bring back Professor Jason Locasale, Professor Mark Skidmore, Dr. Brian Hooker, and Dr. James Lyons-Weiler. I want to start with Professor Jason Locasale. This is actually from a pinned tweet that's on Professor Locasale's Twitter account. And I'm going to read that, and I'm going to use that as a premise to really start this discussion. It says, I left a successful academic career in STEM after publishing 200+ papers. I believed in science and truth, but learned that the system valued optics over integrity, conformity over courage. In academia, bureaucracy replaced discovery, egos replaced expertise, and silence replaced accountability. It's time to speak clearly about what universities have become. So, Professor Locasale, what have universities become, and how can the country's best minds all conform around this ideological compliance?
Hey, thanks, Patrick, for bringing that up, and that was. It's been great to talk to MAHA so far, and the comments I've been getting have been really, really great and really insightful. What have universities become? I think there's essentially a perfect storm that happened in the last 30 years. Some of it began from the college teaching side, where these universities have essentially morphed into recreational services industries. And then it merged with the hospital side and the nonprofit hospitals and the kinds of expansions that they've had in the last 30 years as well, especially with Medicare and other things that are funding them. At the same time, NIH, which is the major funder of biomedical research, its budget doubled. It doubled in the Bush and Clinton years, in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was a time where there was just massive amounts of money flowing into these academic centers, especially in the medical schools. And so these places have essentially grown, and what emerged are giant bureaucracies where positions in the past, which were something a faculty member would do for one day a week or maybe on a Sunday afternoon to clear out some paperwork, now they have massive offices. They have chiefs of staff, they have deputy chiefs of staff, they have assistant deans, associate deans, assistants to the assistant dean, and you have these massive empires inside of these places. And then for the purposes of conducting research and doing science, essentially your stature within those systems is how well you engage with that administration and how you're perceived by them, and how you follow what they what they are interested in. And as many of us in the room know, their interests are not always the interests, and I would say most often they are not the interests of what the public is searching for, which is truth and medical knowledge. They have tremendous financial incentives inside there. There is massive incentivization to expand. Like some of the ideas about the scandals and things that we heard about in the first session. One of the most shocking and I think disheartening moments of reckoning for me as a scientist working in these places is that many of these university medical centers actually like these scandals. They like these scandals because there is an administrator who can take credit for it. There's an administrator who can spend massive amounts of legal fees to justify why they need larger budgets. There is, there's potential for career development within the administration when there is a scandal, and it essentially self-perpetuates itself, and that's just one example. So I think. There's a reckoning about what higher education has become. It's been focused a lot on the teaching side. It's been focused a lot on the politics. And of course, we've seen what the politics has come to be in universities, and there are a lot of people that are not happy with that, including myself. But I think what's lesser discussed is what's happening in these medical schools and these medical centers. How they are funded. Sometimes they're funded up to 90% of their budget is coming from NIH, and the part that's not coming from NIH is likely coming from Medicare subsidies and other federal sources of revenue. What they're producing, what their the kinds of societies, like the kinds of professional organizations that they fund, the journals that they fund, the societies that they fund. How they influence each of those. I think it's a general conversation that we need to discuss a lot more of, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Now, let's actually open that same question to like the rest of our panelists as well. Like each of you have got such strong exposure into academia. How and why are our universities such a cartel for consensus?
I had a very fortunate experience. When my paper was retracted, the MMR autism paper in 2014, I had to answer to my provost. And I sat down with her, and she revealed what a fan she was of health freedom very, very quietly. And I worked for a small, primarily undergraduate institution. And she said, that's actually it's supported and affiliated with the Christian Missionary Alliance. And she said, if you, had come out as a trans activist, we'd be having a different conversation right now. But you've come out as a health freedom activist instead. And I said, well, actually I came out as a scientist, not a health freedom activist. I was just reporting the science. And she stood corrected. But by and large, my university stood by me and was it seemed to be more of a bastion of truth. They had very, very little to lose. There is not pharmaceutical money flowing into Simpson University in Redding, California. There is not an expanse of NIH or National Science Foundation money or you name whatever alphabet soup agency going into Simpson University. So there was very, very little cost. I mean, there was cred. I mean, I think that over the years that I retired from Simpson University in 2023, that they have lost donors because of it. But it was a unique situation, and if it hadn't have been for that situation, I think I literally, in other institutions, knowing what my colleagues have endured, I would have been out in the streets, within milliseconds.
So when Bobby was running for president, I was having visions of grandeur, you know, like, well, he's going to be appointing people like Brian and I to places, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And one of the delusions that I had was, it's a beautiful vision. The day when he and I and Bobby invited all of the deans of the schools of medicine into one room, all of the deans of the graduate schools, Department of Biological Sciences, molecular biology, into one room. And we said, if you want to take pharma money to do research, go in room A and become a pharma university. If you want to qualify for NIH funding, go to room B and join the rest of society and remain humanity. That's the vision that I had. Hasn't happened yet, but fingers crossed, right? So Brian's message is very well put. I mean, what he really said was Simpson University stood by him because they had nothing to lose. During my tenure from graduate school through assistant professor to senior research scientist at the University of Pittsburgh, I watched this transition where the administrators and the accountants took over. So it used to be publish or perish, right? Then it was, well, you get funding and then you got grants, and now it's, they don't care if you publish, just get funding. So it's a business model instead of an enterprise of knowledge.
Okay. I'm at a large public institution in Michigan State University, and I have to say, despite the challenges, I didn't get canned, right? I have a tenure position, but my endowed chair position is in a 5-year renewal. So during this process, my chair was renewed. Amazingly, I had some support. So I'm very thankful for that. At the same time, I did go through a whole bunch of stuff. And so it's a challenge. I'm not in the School of Medicine. So I'm in a different place. So I'm a little separate from all of that. I don't know what would have happened if I was in the School of Medicine. So I really don't know. But I do know that I survived. But it's still a difficult environment to operate in. And I would say I also challenge the notion that the university is still sort of the preeminent source of knowledge and truth. I think there's a growing divide, as we can see here, that we realize that there's a difference between different organizations and that we're trying to get to the truth. And we're starting as a society to realize that universities don't always do that.
Thank you. Professor Skidmore, let's actually just dive a little deeper into your experience of the retracted paper. In 2023, you published what seemed like a very logical study. You looked at the proportionality of someone in their social circle coming across a vaccine injured, what that would make an impact on their own vaccine hesitancy. And you found like it was directly proportional, basically. It's a very logical study, I felt, but yet it was deemed methodologically flawed. It's a very potent word, term, phrase. What does that mean, this methodologically flawed? And do you feel like it was more of a narrative control? And where does it start from? And where does it end? What's our recourse with that?
Well, in the final round with the retraction, there were 3 items that were stated for why the paper was retracted. The first is that I didn't evaluate each case of somebody saying they had a vaccine injury among loved ones, which is not possible in the kind of study that I did. And that was stated as a weakness in the paper from the very beginning. That's not possible, but it was a signal, and that we should do further exploration. So that's the first item. Something they already knew, the editor already knew, the peer reviewers already knew. The second is they said that there were data problems, not necessarily methodological problems, but data problems. I don't know how they could have evaluated that because they did not ask for the data set. And the most controversial part of the study was drawing inferences from the representative sample of people to the population, which is a standard procedure that people in statistics do all the time. The method wasn't controversial, it was the application that was controversial. So if there was a methodological question, it was about using that in the case of potential vaccine injury. And then the last one, there are people who are still angry with me because they think I did something wrong in an ethical sense with the study. The reason for retraction is that I had miscommunicated. They said that I miscommunicated that I had received approval from my institutional review board to conduct the study. With a survey, there's very little harm that can come from answering the survey. So typically you would receive an exemption determination and thereby be approved to continue with the work. In the paper, it said I had received approval from my IRB to continue the work, which was true, but I didn't indicate specifically that there was an exemption determination. And so they said that I had done something wrong. All other articles that I cited that had done survey work all said approved. So it wasn't too far. I could have said approved by way of exemption determination and it would have been corrected. So that was the third reason that the paper was retracted. And so that was the supposedly one of the COPE guidelines. It was an unethical study because I didn't say it was an exemption determination. So those are the kinds of things, and then it gets spun in a certain way to indicate that I have done something wrong and that there's no confidence in me as a researcher, but also the study. You can just throw it out. And so it's a difficult challenge. How do you explain to somebody that situation? They say, no, you're a bad person. You've demonstrated that you're not trustworthy. And then half the world thinks you're awful.
No, thank you for that, Professor Skidmore. And both yourself and Dr. Hooker have actually encountered these retractions, and I'm curious if either of you can speak to just the kind of impact that'll have on one's psyche, and Dr. Lyons-Weiler as well, just in terms of how your approach to future publishing, what is the impact that's going to have on a young scientist somewhere who's made a discovery, and potentially it's an inconvenient evidence, and so how do they marshal the kind of support they really need to go ahead and publish that?
I'm a compulsive rule follower. And I've had to really break out of that mold. Being a health freedom activist at this particular point in my career, as well as a scientist, I break a lot of rules now. So, but there are a lot of societal rules. So, but when the paper was retracted, when I received notification that it had been taken down off the journal's website, I was devastated. I was the type of kid, I never had detention in high school. Are you kidding? I was probably the one that was making them clean the erasers when they had detention in high school. But it took me literally 4 years to go back and encounter that information and republish that data. And I published it in 2018 in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons. I did not find a PubMed indexed journal that would take it, but instead of the actual story about the CDC whistleblower being in the news, which, there were some outlets that were willing to carry it, now the story became, oh, well, there's a scientist, Brian Hooker, and he published this information showing that there was a greater likelihood of having autism diagnosis in African American males that got the MMR on time. now the story was the journal actually retracted that paper, so there's nothing to see here. So it became a non-story. But people really, really enjoyed reporting the non-story. So it was picked up by CNN, it was picked up by ABC News. I think at some point it floated around The Guardian. But it became a very, very popular story to the point where, after a while I thought, my first name is debunked, because whenever I read about myself in the news, it's debunked scientist Dr. Brian Hooker. But it was a complete, visceral gut punch. And if it hadn't been for some of my scientific colleagues that were publishing with me at the time, it would have been really, really hard to get it back up on that bicycle and ride that bicycle. So I think that, weaponizing retractions to end somebody's career, to end somebody's publication, it was indeed punitive, and fortunately it didn't have the effect that I think that they wanted it to have. But it definitely hurts. I mean, there are a lot of things I've endured in my career. That's probably one of the biggest ones.
Brian, I think you landed well. Good work.
I think we should change the rules so that the number of retractions that you have from unethical journals actually is a positive, and we can go head to head, right? And we can boast and say, I'm more likely to fund this person because this unethical journal. So I also had a paper retracted with Paul Thomas. It was a study of 3,300 kids over 10 years. We found 561 unvaccinated kids in the data. None of them had ADHD, 0. Same thing was found in the Henry Ford study. In the best of all possible worlds, the Henry Ford study would have validated the Lyons-Weiler and Thomas study, and then all of medicine would say, hey, is that what you're seeing? And then they would replicate it. That's why they have to kill these papers, so that nobody goes, hey, I'm kind of seeing the same thing. It's that siloization and keeping people apart and keeping them in the dark and keeping them separate, which, if you think about it, is really censorship and a violation of the First Amendment. And if there's any federal government involvement in censorship through these journals, that's a crime. I know there's some press that wanted to talk to me about the notices these journals have received. So those criminals have to be found through discovery by the Attorney General's office, and more power to them. I hope that they get each and every last one of them.
It is a challenge too, because anybody can complain to a journal, anybody can complain to a university, and they are obligated to respond. That's part of their job, but we're not allowed to see who and what their conflicts of interest might be. So I'm looking forward to the discovery to find out which groups or individuals are submitting such complaints. I think I'm a big fan of transparency all the way around. I like data being made available as part of studies. I like reviews being made available. I like if something like this happens, then there should be a very clear path, and people should stand up, should be required to stand up and tell us who they are if they are complaining.
That's fantastic. Dr. Lyons-Weiler, you've created a journal, which you mentioned in today's opening remarks, and that journal was cited during Secretary Kennedy's confirmation hearing. How have you gone about the creation of that journal? How have you maintained a level of scientific integrity to ensure that dissenting ideas don't get retracted?
I'm a benevolent dictator. Don't you know that already? No, seriously, the way that scientists handle controversy during the peer review is really interesting. If Brian submits a paper to my journal, there'll be 2 or 3 reviewers that look at it. They might agree or disagree, but then they give him feedback. And it's his job to update the paper at that time and give feedback. If the reviewers miss something, that's on us. I'm the editor-in-chief. That's not on him. With the, hey, you didn't say that this was exemption from the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, for those who don't know it, versus approved, that's on the journal. That's not on the mark. They should have caught that during peer review. Okay, so my journal is open access. It's not yet PubMed listed. One day it will be. It's independent. I have advertisement there for nonprofits, which we give away. So if you have a nonprofit, send an 800 by 800 pixel. We'll drive traffic to you. But the specific difference between our journal and COPE qualified journals is that in our instructions to authors, we specifically state we do not retract for differences of opinion or interpretation. It will retract for fraud. We will retract for severe methodological problems. But the process that we follow is we send the complaint to the author. The author has a chance to rebut, and then we would publish the complaint and with the person's name on it for transparency, because in Western civilization you have a right to see your accuser in all adjudication. Right? It's just tyranny gets in through the back door if anybody can accuse you in the dark. So you publish the complaint, you publish the rebuttal, and you let the scientific community decide. Retraction's not on the table in that case because this study may still be right in spite of what that particular problem might be, or parts of it might be right. But, you know, we will go to the ends of the earth to give the authors the chance to defend themselves. And there are traditional mechanisms, such as Mark's quote-unquote error of not having that it was exempt, not approved. There's a device in journals. It's called an erratum. It's a one-line publication in this, and if he's a nice guy, so he's likely to say, we apologize for any, confusion or any burden on you. But there's erratum, there's core agenda, there's lots of ways. But the most important thing, if we're going to fix science in this area, is discourse, talking to each other, unfettered conversations. And I remember when Clubhouse came about, the tyrants found out that people were talking about things about academia and so on, and they're having unfettered conversations over there. Somebody put that on Twitter. I'm like, yeah? Okay, everybody, heads up, fetter your conversations. It's time to fetter them. Have you ever had a fettered conversation? I don't even know what that is. So our language does not anticipate tyranny. If you think about it, it's a beautiful thing. You can't fetter a conversation. It doesn't work. So what I want to say is that our journal, Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, yeah, we charge a fee for publication. I have an editorial staff to pay them and all the rest. But we're in it to make sure that knowledge is disseminated, and that's it. Okay, so all of science, all of clinical research, all of public health can publish there. And I'd like to see people in law do more legal analyses and publish academic treatises and like legal presses and things like that. But everyone's afraid. Everyone's afraid that they're not going to get that job. It's horrible in legal publishing. All of the legal journals are conforming to the narrative of the day at the same time, because all legal are looking down the career path as well. But it would be really interesting society to live in if there was a very controversial case coming up to the Supreme Court, and we actually had unfettered conversation on the legal options and the things that were going on, right? It'd be really interesting. We could kind of participate in our democracy, the democratic processes, and our judiciary in a little more informed way that way. But we don't have that. What we have is a cloistering of know-how for strategic and other reasons.
And do we feel like we have that level of freedom within academic institutions to have that level of discourse and a discussion on like these dissenting ideas, or do we feel like even that is shut down at the fundamental institutions of knowledge?
I'll go quick. I'll have a quick answer to this, and I'll pass it on. When I wrote my book, The Environmental and Genetic Causes of Autism, I called Dr. Richard Fry, and I said, you don't know me, but I know you. I've read all your work. Would you like to write the foreword to my book? He read the book. He said, oh my gosh, this is a great book. You just defined the next 3 years of my research. I said, great. He said, yeah, I'll write the foreword. I said, great. Now that I have it all in one place, all neurologists, all developmental biologists, all pediatricians, all the people doing neuroscience around natal development, they need to know. And he said, they already know. They'll just have their funding cut by Fauci if they talk about it. And when I was an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, there was a colleague of mine who was doing studies in neurological studies in mice. And I said, hey, I think that amyloid stuff in the brain on Alzheimer's is part aluminum, because there's a reference. It's aluminum, it's amyloid precursor protein, and it's silica. And he said, don't say that. You will never get funded. So that's kind of self-censorship and allowing that censorship to be visited upon you instead of, finding a way.
Well, maybe I'll just add, throughout this whole session, we've been talking about ways that we could increase transparency, find ways to provide consequences for people who do these things that are clearly wrong, appropriate punishment, and all of these layers. And so as an economist, you think about costs and benefits, or, risk versus benefit in the medical field. And so one is we're increasing the cost of doing bad behavior. But I also wonder if in our society we can think about how to bring truth and virtue just up a little bit higher on our hierarchies. You're only on this earth for a short time, so it's hard to know what life was like before you, but it feels like to me that truth and virtue are less important, and other things. And they can be, things like, I don't want my family to starve, right? I want to keep my job. But those are really hard choices to make, and some people, it's just a little bit higher up and they're willing to sacrifice, and other people maybe not. So how do we, I think, Justin, you said the consciousness, how can we as a society bring that higher on our priorities? And as an economist, I'll say one last thing. Adam Smith said that a market-oriented economy like we have, a prerequisite is that we have some moral character in our base. And without it, the economy won't work very well. It's become very inefficient.
Great. So outside of retractions, I want to take us to the selective use of data. We heard that today as well in the opening remarks. Dr. Hooker, I'll take this to you first, but then opening this up to the panel as well. When you published your 2014 study that linked MMR vaccines to autism, that was using CDC's own data through the data use agreement that you had. And what you found is that there was, in their original study, which you refuted in 2004, the Stefano et al. Study, that you found that they weren't using, that they had drastically pared down the representative sample because they had chosen to not use the data of individuals who didn't really have a Georgia birth certificate. And since then, you've actually gone and looked at 6 different CDC studies and talked about either a methodological flaw or potentially a selective use of data. So I'd love for us to unpack that, because that is actually like much harder to go after. Like, how do we really ensure that there is a strong ethical standard around the use of selective use of data?
Well, all of the CDC studies that are done, and the way that they should be done, is to have a methodological plan prior to conducting the study, okay? And so that methodological plan, there was one for the MMR study, and they did deviate from the plan that they had approved by CDC officials. And the way that they deviated from that plan, Patrick, as you accurately stated, was that they pared down for the race analysis. When they were looking at different race categories, they said, we will only report individuals or data and results based on individuals that have a valid state of Georgia birth certificate. And so we tried to unpack that, like, why would you do that? We looked at birth certificate information. I went in the Wayback Machine and tried to find Georgia birth certificates to see what information they might have that would elucidate more regarding these particular children. Well, it was simply a matter of, if you included the children that were born out of state, you saw the statistically significant effect. If you excluded those children, then the effect went away. And statistical power is based on numbers. The larger the cohort, the larger the group that you had, then the more statistical power you had. So if you do the opposite, if you winnow down, then you eliminate statistical power, and they eliminated the signal. It's not the only time the CDC has done this. They were actually cherry-picking data on their thimerosal study, the study that came out in 2003. The lead author was Dr. Thomas Verstraeten. And they found a clinic in Redwood City, California. It was part of the HMOs that they were looking at for the data for this study. They found that there was more autism in this particular clinic, which was not a reason to disqualify this clinic and remove the clinic. The reason was that they had was, once they removed this clinic, then again, they were able to remove a statistically significant signal that showed a relationship between thimerosal exposure and autism. Okay, cherry-picking data, deviating from an analysis plan, from a programmatic approved analysis plan, those are all red flags, and they never should have been done.
Got it. Thank you for that. But then also, you were able to reanalyze that study, and I believe in 2018, you looked at also comorbidities associated with that data, and then you republished that. Why do we think, and question to the general panel here, such a study potentially wasn't revalidated by others? Like, you've published this landmark study, you've found these links. What's causing someone else to doing a revalidation of it?
I think there's so much institutional pressure. I mean, my situation was different. And I had a institution that supported academic freedom, and they said they supported academic freedom to their credit, but they did not have a whole lot to lose by, there aren't bunches of federal grants flowing, through my former institution. And so, but it is a bloodbath. I know several researchers right now that are going through it with their universities. I know several independent researchers, Dr. Peter McCullough, Kevin McKernan, Dr. Sabine Hazan, that are doing groundbreaking work, but retraction has been weaponized against them, basically to sideline them, and to some instances, there are individuals that are throwing these therapeutic interventions that some of them are publishing onto the public domain so they can do the greatest good. But the reason why the retraction occurred was so somebody could instead take the same technology and patent it as somebody else. So these are the things that are going on.
Let's not forget, Brian, that we also have no NIH funding for vaccine safety research for the pediatric schedule, zero, right. None, zero, ever. That they had cloistered vaccine safety in the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, into a not-for-profit oversight, the kind of like review, professional by the Institutes of Medicine. They're part of the National Academy of Science, to review studies funded by or conducted by CDC on the pediatric schedule because the parents had complained and there were so many lawsuits. And so they would have, had they not violated the mandate of Congress, they would have done a report every 2 years. Correct. And they just didn't do it. It was found by Del Bigtree's ICANN organization that they just didn't do it. So why didn't they do it? They didn't do it because they didn't want to know. And there's a pattern here in vaccination during pregnancy. Tom Shimabukuro, we call him the CDC's fixer, would go into the data from the VSD, he'd analyze it and then minimize any harm to the fetus at all to the point where they stopped looking. But there is like a 4,200% increase in influenza vaccine-related fetal demise that he didn't tell Verback. He hid it, and then parents cornered him and said, where are those data? He pulled out a CD, put it on his laptop, and showed the data. Same thing with RSV, same thing with COVID. Now let me ask you, vaccination in pregnancy really needs to be on the priority of what CDC looks at, or what NIH looks at, what HHS looks at right now. I've never seen a woman go through a pregnancy, right, and get influenza, RSV, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and COVID in the same pregnancy. But women are getting all of those antigens during pregnancy. And it's severely problematic that CDC committed fraud. It's just fraud. So this isn't like a nice little scientist A disagrees with scientist B, right? And we respect to each other and we go ahead and disagree. I want to enforce the demarcation so that our society doesn't hate science. The demarcation of fraud in science is very clear. And there's no nice way to put it. They need to be investigated, they need to be prosecuted, and we need to be done with them.
Other comments from over there?
Yeah, I think just trying to summarize some of the deeper systemic issues that might be in play. I think a lot of this comes from the transparency and the lack of transparency inside the institutions. They say they believe in academic freedom. They say they believe in due process when there's a issue involving scientific integrity. And the public expects that these institutions, if they're built to serve public good, and they say they are, that they're operating with basic constitutional-like protections that we expect. I mean, we all learn about free speech in our civics class. We all learn about due process. In reality, what tends to happen in these sorts of investigations, when an issue of a complaint about a topic or a study comes about, is that universities engage their legal teams. The legal team makes a decision about which side to take based on what the interests of the administrator, particularly who called the investigation, and that administrator represents what they say they are, the university, and they are the science, to be frank. And so they make decisions based on these. And so when you're operating under a system that's behaving this way, where you have one person upset with you, can essentially ruin your livelihood and make it hard for you to earn a living in the future. It's very difficult to say anything critical or say anything controversial, to say anything that's outside of what is generally accepted. And that's where I think a lot of these issues are, where we're not really studying these things because it just takes one person to say, oh, that's not something good you should talk about, or to even just give the impression that that's something you shouldn't be talking about, and that's all it really takes. Because once that happens, then you engage these systems, that you engage these kinds of the kinds of kangaroo courts and the things that we see inside these institutions, whether it's in the journals or whether it's in the academic medical centers. People are frankly fearful of them. And I think, without transparency and without basic protections that people feel that they need in order to be able to study what they want to study, in order to be able to say what they want to say, I think it's impossible to get any kind of reform on any issue.
I want to weigh in and say that if there's any taboo in science, it's not science. And anybody operating under a partial narrative because they dare not tell the truth are not scientists. And if you apply for NIH grant funding and you bias your language, you bias anything about your grant that says it's commonly known that vaccines don't cause autism or anything like that, you're not really doing due diligence on the facts, and it's fraud. It's a common word. We're going to hear fraud over and over and over again. You cannot defraud the US government for the next 4 years and do something other than science. And so let's be clear that the self-policing, the trying not to piss somebody off because you might lose your career, if that puts you in a position where you feel like you should not talk about it, that's a sure sign you should talk about it.
What's also interesting is like there's also a clear commercial impact like that we've heard here today. Like I remember reading that on YouTube, if you publish a video that says that vaccines causes autism, you're going against the prevailing body of evidence, and by doing so, you're endangering public harm. So, and that's sufficiently good enough for them to blacklist you, and your videos never get any views. And so there's a clear, that's like one example, and clearly there's much more.
That brings up the downstream effects. We were going to talk about the downstream effects of, what are the downstream effects of retraction and weaponization of science? And if those of you who don't know, if you do a study, someone's supposed to replicate it, and then more people are supposed to replicate it, and then you put all the studies together, line them up, and you do something called a systematic review, and then you do a meta-analysis. And if they throw out the results they don't like, they're biasing not just that one study, they're biasing the meta-analysis. That's just an assault on all of us. That's just completely unacceptable from trust in science. And if science is going to survive, we're going to have to fight against this with all of our might. We're going to have to redo meta-analysis, putting studies back in that were left out for inconvenient results. We're going to have to see that. And I can see HHS funding major programs of looking back over the fraudulent science and bringing forward assessment studies. What happened? Reanalyses and republication of old data.
I do think that one of the downstream effects, and you can fill in the blank whether you think it's intended or unintended, is that people get sick and die. One of the tragedies about kicking the can down the road regarding the autism epidemic over the past 25 years plus, since they started the inception of the Retractions study in 1999, is that the autism rates went from 1 in 500 to 1 in 31. And if you think that autism is like the good doctor, please come to my house. I will invite you in, and by all means, you will be helping. And you will be cleaning up, the collateral damage. 40% of children that are on the autism spectrum are severe. Most of them non-speakers, non-verbal. They're trapped in bodies that betray them. If you think it's a gift, think again. And so this is the cost of fraud. This is the cost of lying. It's not, it's not just folded hands and people receiving lots of money. No, people die. People get sick. Babies die of SIDS or whatever you want to call it. They have a million different definitions of SIDS because they had to make sure that SIDS went down in the Back to Sleep campaign. And so now they've split the diagnosis codes, knowing that the rate of infant deaths did go up, and we have the highest rate of infant mortality in the United States of any other developed nation.
I think the other downstream effect is all of the good research that ends up not getting done because it's not funded. We just don't know how much we could have learned because really bright minds aren't doing the work.
What's also interesting is when a study is found to be flawed, and the government has chosen to take them to court. So I'm referring to the Keller study, which was mentioned in the earlier panel. I think study 329, which clearly it was funded by GlaxoSmithKline, and they used selective use of data, and they show that SSRIs were effective in adolescents from age 12 to 18. It became the most widely cited study. And now we clearly know that study was had a lot of methodological flaws, selective use of data. But even then, that study is not retracted. Why is that?
You leave a legacy of what's called a citation index, and many people will cite flawed and fraudulent studies. So you know your street cred goes up as a researcher. There's a study that was co-authored by, Jack can tell me what year it came out, the MITCA study. What year did the MITCA study come in? 2017, something like that?
Yes.
It's not really even a study, it's a simulation. And it is a simulation that has been cited over and over and over again by the CDC, by the Statin Serum Institute in Denmark that recently published the Anderson et al. Study that was to indemnify aluminum in vaccines from the autism epidemic, and about 49 other things at the same time. So when these flawed, fraudulent studies stand the test of time, unfortunately, then they become the lore, they become the foundation, the faulty foundation that other quote-unquote science can be built on.
Yeah, and I published 3 analyses that destroyed MITKIS. I mean, it's just garbage. It's misleading. They say, okay, here's an injection of aluminum. It goes into 3 main compartments, so divide that dose by 3. It goes in, and then we'll divide that by 365 because there's 365 days in the year. I mean, this is done with crayons. I think Bobby Kennedy should retract MITKIS through FDA. We're in control of the HHS. Retract MITKIS, retract MITKIS, retract MITKIS. We need that.
So I have like one final question, and I want to end on a positive note. If we were to build an entirely new system that was void of this fear, void of loss of NIH funding or a tenure track or being sued like we heard in the prior panel, what would that, and let's call it like the MAHA Science 2.0. I would love to understand from each of our panelists, what would the 3 principles, and I don't mean abstract principles, but in reality, what would that look like if we were to rebuild this? Both in academia, in journals, but also as a researcher. We'll start with you, Professor Skidmore.
Well, my first thought is, in addition to trying to reform existing institutions, we need to create new institutions. And so we have MAHA, we have CHD, we have IPAC EDU. We have new journals being created that are legitimate and authentic. We are creating new media outlets. And all of those things are really important to create, if you will, competition and alternative to something that's not right.
I think an important part of it is merit. I think we really need a return to merit and accountability. You do good science, you get rewarded. You do bad science, you do not get rewarded. I think that's the fundamental issue of any functioning, any well-run organization.
I think transparency is key. Right now, everything is so enshrouded, everything is so hidden. If you're a peer reviewer, and I don't like Jack's shoes, then I can, your shoes are an homage to Ward Cleaver. They're so good. the peer review process is completely opaque. You do not know who reviewed your paper. And, damn it, when the peer review that I received back from a journal says that Dr. Hooker is an anti-vaxxer, period, end of sentence, I really would like to know who wrote that thing, because that's not a peer review. That is not acceptable. But, and data transparency. The data sets that have been enshrouded in the CDC, the vaccine safety data link that I know personally has at least 10,000 unvaccinated children. It's total bullcrap that they can't do a vax-unvax study. They could have done it many, many years ago. They just refused to do it. But all of that needs to be crowdsourced. It needs to be put in the open public domain. You can do it without a HIPAA violation. You can do it with maintaining patient confidentiality. Anybody that tells you differently, spit in their eye on behalf of me, it's absolutely not true. We need this transparency.
Yeah.
So because you insulted my shoes, I'm going to take the opposite approach. And dissent is healthy, right? So I've thought about this a lot. I mean, a lot. It's kept me up at night for years. I think for questions that are a matter of public health, where hundreds of millions of people are impacted on the outcome of the science, those corporations or entities, universities that have a chance to financially benefit should throw money into a big kitty. Then it could be matched by federal funds too. And then scientists bid to do that research on behalf of the companies, but the companies do not know who they are. And it's illegal for them to personally benefit, if I'm a scientist, to have a financial conflict of interest or develop one. My job is to issue a report and publish the report anonymously, so it's not about career development, publish or perish. I'm just bringing the bacon home to the university or wherever I am. All subject to the transparency that Brian was talking about. The data analysis plan first, put it on blockchain. Publish your data analysis plan and stick to it. Right? And auditable, transparent, so that we know that the people doing the studies, if they have any bias, it's a personal bias for some reason other than financial or career. So we can break the links between the funding and the perverse funding, the perverse and misaligned incentives, then we can get to the truth. If we don't do that, then I'm afraid that there's going to be backroom deals, there's going to be back scratching, there's going to be a lot of problems. Then once the data become public, then everybody else can analyze it and they can say, oh, well, this report's okay, but look what we also found. You can build your career on that, but we just have to have, we can write ourselves permission to talk about vaccine safety research and so on. And I think, given that it's not just vaccines, drug studies are also terribly biased. We've heard many examples cited. I could cite you many more. That if there are drugs that are going to potentially be used by a market that's a certain size, the same rules apply. Why do we trust? I mean, look at how bad it got with COVID. Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, they published through press release with a promise of data later. They would then run home and sell their stock, half of their stock. That still hasn't been prosecuted. Where's the pump and dump prosecution? Right? That's insider trading. So, and then if the bad guy still had the HHS and CDC was still following their plan, a former CDC director said that they were going to rely less on peer-reviewed science and just on preprints. So they're lowering the level of evidence for public health emergencies. And let's remember, the reason why the safeguards are there is in case of an emergency. It says right on the glass, break in case of emergency, right? So let's keep the safeguards there for public health emergencies so that we can act rapidly, which is now reasonably easy. But let's keep all the options on the table, like treatments. Let's keep all the medical options. Fauci actually said, we don't want too many people to get this virus. We're doing a lockdown because if too many people get the virus, they'll be immune. We won't need a vaccine. Verbatim. He actually said this. I mean, so that's like A1, Tony. That's good transparency. Thank you. But if we don't break the perverse incentives, and I published an analysis of the perverse incentives with Paul Thomas. If we don't break them, then there's going to be backroom deals. I really think we have to do that.
A huge round of applause to our panelists here.
Thank you.
Let's do some Q&A from the audience.
Gentlemen, great job. Thank you, MAHA Institute, for hosting today. My question is kind of from the last panel. We're at epidemic levels right now of psychostimulants and SSRIs. And I wanted to ask you, one of the person was talking about regulate. I mean, are we at the point where there was a interview with Tom Cruise and Matt Lauer 20 years ago, where we're stepping into the brave new world as far as these drugs are concerned? Is that where we're at as far as these drugs? Because it's, from my research, it's 4 times larger than opioids and addiction.
Well, you asked the last panel. I don't know if anybody's here that wants to take that from the last panel. Anybody from the last panel want to step up? Okay, so obviously the over-medicalization of normal human behavior is something that Laura Delamo, you want to stand up, Laura?
There we go.
Yeah, she has a great book called Unshrunk. Everybody should get a copy of that book and support Inner Compass, the non-for-profit. What we have are people who have become automatons in medicine, automatons in schools, automatons just to follow the rules, get these kids into their wobble chairs and get them to stop asking questions or being uppity, if you will, get them to settle down or deal with normal crises that happen in the world by drugging them with that. And that needs to stop by not putting aluminum into the human body anymore. That's the number one thing to do.
Vaccines, yep.
Yeah, let's stop putting aluminum. We stop mercury. Let's stop putting aluminum in there.
Well, if the unvaccinated children are now at 0 for ADHD.
Exactly, that's a great point. So that's a great example. What other psychotropic meds would no longer be necessary because kids do not have the symptoms that we medicalize that are actually root cause aluminum intoxication or something. And so we're on that. I mean, we're on that in a big way. Aluminum's going to be addressed. But the solutions that I see coming are integrative and they're holistic, they're non-pharmaceutical, and we need research on integrative pathways to health. So we know which combination of non-pharmaceutical therapies, over-the-counters, diet, sunshine, exercise, community. Put your damn screens down if you're a parent. Put your damn screens down if you're a parent. Put your damn screens down if you're a parent, because your kids will do what you do. They won't do what you tell them to do, right? They need you. Grandparents, your kids need you to get them out into the sunshine and enjoy nature with them. So all across all the United States, coast to coast, please pause before you give a child another drug. That's step one. Just pause and think.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have Jim Thomas, or next, is he still here? Katie Hirsch. Oh, Jim's here. Here you go, thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for the panel. It's been great. And in the hearing where Susan Monyeres was dismissed, she's a parasitologist who specializes in toxoplasmosis, was the head of the CDC. Senator Cassidy, Bill Cassidy, said he is all for radical transparency. Yet we still don't know what's inside these vaccines, what the adjuvants are. They're secret, and what the contaminants are. They're also secret. And how can we encourage Senator Bill Cassidy to work toward revealing what's inside these vaccines? Because anytime we're mandating something be injected into our children, it shouldn't be possible for there to be secret ingredients.
Where to start? Oh my goodness. So many different things that need to be done. The pharmaceutical lobby has, for every representative, senator and congressional representatives, that's 535, has at least 3 lobbyists for each one of them. And they pump millions and millions of dollars into Capitol Hill, into these, PACs, private coffers, whatever, for these individuals. And so that needs to stop. It absolutely needs to stop. Big Pharma, in terms of lobbying, outpaces oil and gas 3-to-1, by 3 times. And so Senator Cassidy is incentivized not to know what is in vaccines and not to release and dare not let the public know what is in vaccines.
Yeah, the good news is, to me, is we don't need Senator Cassidy to agree. ACIP is going to have this hearing on aluminum. It's coming, people. They're going to look at it's coming. And this is the first time they're doing their job on this issue ever. Somebody, I think it was last night at a meeting, said that we're now allowed to talk about risk in a different way at ACIP. I think it was Robert Malone. And I can't help but think, but I don't remember hearing the word risk once in the last 15 years at any ACIP meeting, right? They would talk about signals. They would talk about euphemisms for risk. And I remember one time watching, I know it was an ACIP meeting, and I was saying, say it, say risk, say it, just say it. So it's a different world. We don't need Senator Cassidy. I'm sure he's a good person. He's got plenty of things to do with his time. I really think he's got plenty of other problems to worry about than vaccines. I wish Secretary Kennedy all the best in his mission.
Thank you for your panel. I kind of had most of my questions kind of answered, but I'll run through them real quick. Is there a policy that could be put in place to do post-approval accountability for the drugs that are already on the market? And then is there any possibility that we could get research done on natural lifestyle solutions or anything other than chemical interventions, something that people can't profit on?
To speak to the first one, Secretary Kennedy has a blueprint for being able to automate the vaccine adverse event reporting system. It was done in a medical group called the Harvard Pilgrim Medical Group in New England, and this was back, in 2011, the report came out from Ross Lazarus, who was the lead author on the study. And when they did this report, they found that the probable vaccine adverse events were not 1 in a million, they were not 1 in 2 million, they were not 1 in 1,000, they were 1 in 39. And the CDC then suspended all conversations and all contact with those researchers because the CDC, quite frankly, did not want to know, and at that point did not want to automate the VAERS system. But Secretary Kennedy has already talked about automating the VAERS system, and then there's another system that I think that we can apply additional pressure on called the FAERS system, which is for pharmaceutical drug adverse events, and that is run by the FDA. And so I think equal pressure needs to be put on FAERS and VAERS as well.
Yeah, those are good points. So I want to point out that under U.S. regulatory rules, people should submit their adverse events for vaccines and for drugs, not just through these systems, but also to the pharmaceutical companies, because if enough people submit the same adverse event that was not found in the clinical trials, that then triggers a rule from the FDA to call them back to the drawing board and say you have to do more science on it. In that setting, then we have guys like Vinay Prasad, who is absolutely saying, okay, we're going to follow the rules. It's got to be real evidence. You have to meet the gold standard. We're not going to turn a blind eye. We're not going to let you manipulate the data. So yeah, there's every opportunity for, if you have already submitted to VAERS and FAERS, there's no expiration date on this. You can submit your adverse event to the pharmaceutical companies, and they have to then report to the FDA that they received those reports.
Yeah, for the research, for the question about the research and how we might be able to consider more lifestyle, more environmental factors in understanding health, which is something I've worked a lot in my own scientific interests. I really see the center of this as NIH. It's really, there's nothing inside NIH's charter that says we have to fund research of interest to particular pharmaceutical interests. There is no reason why entire institutes at NIH have possibly upwards to 80 to 90% of their budgets built around studying certain theories or certain hypotheses that are of interest to particular pharmaceutical interventions. There's essentially nothing in there. There's nothing in NIH that says we have to devote the research funding to these areas. There are some entrenchments within NIH, and of course, if you try to change something, it's a difficult political operation, but that's really where the direction should be held, and seeing some of these MAHA principles brought into NIH, I think is really key, and I think that's something that should be advocated for.
Hi, my question to the panel regarding the statins, based on information we know, why the AMA, that is American Medical Association, won't instruct the doctors to stop, I repeat, to stop writing statin prescriptions?
Could you repeat that, please? It was a little hard to.
Well, based on the information regarding the statins that we knew, why the AMA, American Medical Association, won't instruct the doctors to stop writing statin prescriptions? Statin, yeah.
There's, so many cardiologists will just hide behind standard of care, and I think that needs to be blown out of the waters, because it's the standard of care, based on whatever prevailing authority is something that these individuals hide behind, and it's very, very difficult, but it's almost like they're automatrons or they're robots. They hear that, they hear a question about a statin. I'm a heart patient. I had single bypass surgery in 2021. Yeah, my cardiologist, we of course had the conversation about statins, and all he could say was, oh, well, this is the standard of care, and that's what we have to follow.
So there are two views on statins. The views of the doctors who are physicians and they have really healthy patients, and then the doctors who have really sick patients who are also under polypharmacy. Right. The science that was done on statins that showed that they were best in class and safe, they were done on the sick population that were also polypharmacy, and they were compared to other drugs. So when you have somebody like, David Brownstein, who publishes that statins are horrible, he's looking at it from the lens of take a very, very healthy human being, put them on statins because they have high blood pressure or diabetes, that they're just starting, and then boom, you see them decline because of the statins. So we need to have a national conversation on statins. I thank you for bringing it up. We can't, no one in HHS can flip a switch and say, we're going to make you stop prescribing statins. And one of the greatest frustrations of the public that I've seen is that they just think that Bobby can snap his fingers. They think anybody at HHS can snap their fingers and just invoke a new rule. They can't. And first of all, the rule could be reversed on them in a court of law for being arbitrary. That's number one. Number two, there has to be a considered process, even if it's obvious to you that this is wrong. And so I really thank you for bringing it up. There's an important question.
Hi. This came from the previous panel, but I think it's just as suitable for anybody on this during this day to answer. But I do want to say a bit about it. So it was about the serotonin issue that the studies came up to show that we don't innately have a serotonin deficiency that SSRIs are going to fix, and I would agree with that. However, I would question that the fact that we are consuming glyphosate on a daily basis, that does disrupt the gut biome, which would then lead to a serotonin deficiency. So there's science there that's not being looked at, which is the cause of it, not just the fixing of it. So I did want to mention that. I don't know if you want to address that, but what I really want to have addressed is when we see studies that come up that are counter to what the narrative has been, we all know that Snopes has been bought, right? Is there an independent collaboration of journals or scientists that can come together and say, look, this that was put out is inaccurate, and here's the science that you need to look at? Is there any type of independent Snopes, right, that can negate the information that's being put out?
You know what I love about the moms and what they've taught us is to think about everything. Right? Like I'm a guy, so I silo-wise, right? For years it's silo-wise. And it's like, no, Dr. Jack, you have to think about everything. And what you're really talking about is an integrative understanding of the root cause of disease, and that's a priority. So you brought up serotonin, which is really important because there's been messaging that serotonin is not related, and that there's also this other strange messaging. We heard it today, and I'm not criticizing anyone, but that Justin, you mentioned that there was fraud on amyloid. But one of the great ways to keep aluminum in the diet is to conduct fraud on amyloid and then catch the fraud on amyloid and destroy the narrative on amyloid as being involved in some way when it's part aluminum. And if you take, for instance, kids that have Down syndrome and they're self-injurious or aggressive, you give them intranasal insulin, it breaks up the amyloid, and then you pull the aluminum out, they don't have self-injury anymore. So amyloid's doing something unhealthy. It's not just a nice little, thing there. And I think the dynamics of what you're getting at is really, I would ask it this way. There's diversity of opinion on serotonin. What happens with the health outcomes if we address the root causes? Right?
Yeah.
So the narrative is kind of a distraction to me. It's like what happens.
People have tested deficient for serotonin that have mental health issues. So, that is, but I would rather address the cause of that than just give them an SSRI. But I just think the cause of it is not being addressed.
Think about it this way. If there's a microbiome effect on serotonin, and then there's a microbiome effect on other things that really kind of destroy the person's life and they're not feeling good about their life holistically, and you address the root cause, you solve both problems. I'm not saying it's not important to understand serotonin and its role, but I can't believe I'm saying this. It's reductionist, right? It's reductionist to tie it together and make medicine hinge on a mechanism of something that we know we're supposed to have. We're supposed to have serotonin, right? So I think if we just focus on root causes of disease and focus on the integrative pathways to health, integrative pathways to mental health, and study those process protocols that make people have better days, their serotonin will come up. And then they can be happy, they can be well-adjusted without ever necessarily answering the mechanistic question. Because the reason why mechanisms for serotonin up or down are thought to be important is because, of course, someone's going to make a drug to make your serotonin up or down, or a synthetic serotonin or something, rather than address the root cause. So thank you, Zen.
Just got a brief comment on that. So I think one of the issues we're really thinking about, generally speaking, at this meeting is basically we have these conceived consensus of science that are out there. We learned about that during COVID and all the excesses that resulted from that, and a lot of that comes from the combination of the journals, of the professional societies, of the medical associations that all converge onto taking positions on these topics, and they're obviously exaggerated in many cases, or there's fraud in others, and I think what we learn from that is that to the extent that we have skepticism about these institutions, we must create new ones, thinking about things like new journals and bringing credibility to those journals, showing that rigorous science and rigorous analysis, rigorous thought can be done in these new structures, and I think I really see that's that's the key way forward, that we can ultimately compete with medical organizations and journals and professional societies when they say don't touch something like an SSRI.
Maybe we'll take one more question. Oh.
Hi, thank you so much for having this here, and I feel really privileged to have served as a U.S. Public Health Service officer for my entire career. And we've talked about a lot about what we can't do as a society, but I think the taxpayers could probably expect more from their government. So why should the government promote journals that are advertisements for industry? You know, if we have a PubMed that says advertisement on the top of the journal masthead, if they're not following the law and revealing their funding sources, I think that's wrong for the taxpayer to do that. I have a friend at NIH who's brilliant. His research has been cited here already, I'm sure. He's focused on developing patents because he can get a cut of the patents. I think that's unethical for a government scientist to get money from his patents. I also have been through many trainings as a government employee, ethics trainings every year on this or that. Why not have an ethics training that includes this kind of discussion to all the young, bright, and bushy-tailed doctors that come to NIH so they can hear an alternative to what they're faced up to? I started out at NIH and wanted to do nutrition research, and they explained, no, we don't do research in nutrition here, Dr. Hal. We're about drug development. And so I did nutrition research on the side of my desk, despite what my bosses wanted me to do. And the doctors there are many, many good and dedicated physicians and scientists at the NIH and FDA. If they're really good, they get let go. If they're not so good, then they stay. But if they were given encouragement to be independent, to ask questions, to question authority, I think that we'd get a better result for our taxpayer dollars. And there's also something called a False Claims Act. It seems like that's one powerful tool that anybody in the government could use to really make a lot of this industry corruption go away. Do you have any thoughts about that? Thank you.
All really good points. I wanted to address the patent incentivization and what you're referring to, and correct me if the number has changed, but if you have a patent issued or you have a portfolio patent issued, then royalties and revenue streams that the federal agency gets from that, like the National Institutes of Health, then as an inventor, you can get a portion of those particular proceeds up into it's $150,000 a year. Okay, per. And so if I had one licensing agreement, I did patent research while I was at a Department of Energy laboratory, and at that point in time, it was still $150,000. I would more than double my income by doing that. And so, yeah, the incentive was on to commercialize technologies. And commercialized technologies, you know, in the face of feeding a family, in the face of providing for developmentally disabled son's future ad infinitum, long after I'm worm food, then yeah, that spoke volumes. But that type of incentivization needs to go away, absolutely needs to go away, because of especially what we learned over COVID in the very, very incestuous relationship between the NIAID and Moderna.
I agree completely that we need to reform medical education, not just workshop. We can't workshop this. I think Secretary Kennedy made an announcement that the medical schools need to start teaching nutrition, right on point. Now, generalize that. If every physician that treated an infection that traveled from the nose to the back of the skull into the brain saw what happened with saline douche with iodine, they would never, ever scarify that person's tissue again and do surgery. They wouldn't have to. Where's the money from that? Where's the money from using iodine? Last time I saw that happen to a person, it was my stepson. The doctor said, well, where did you get iodine? That was the answer. And he said, drugstore. And then he said, well, I'm sure it was the antibiotics. You see, they don't want to know. So where's the accreditation? Let's look at accreditation processes. Let's review them nationally. Let's see if we can incentivize accreditation bodies in ways that pharmaceutical companies have been incentivizing them for years, and say, we want high quality integrative medicine to be the national standard, the norm, and let's do rotations. Let's find the 10,000 independent doctors that are out there doing things like povidone iodine and others, like Dr. David Brownstein, and offer rotations. Go do a rotation there, or do a residency, and bring that know-how home to your practice or to your hospital.
Thank you, Jack. We're going to take one more question from Sue, and then...
Okay. Thank you so much, all of you. I loved your point, Dr. Jack, earlier in your opening remarks about, and I've never heard this before, focusing on discourse rather than retraction. And when Dr. Masterjohn spoke in the last session, very creative ideas about how we could open things up. In the FDA, for example, so instead of open source medicine, open journals, open drug approvals. What a fascinating idea. And so the one thing that I didn't hear mentioned, though, was informed consent. That's a phrase that I have not heard yet today. And so I wanted to ask the panel, how do we, and Dr., is it Jason Locasale? So you talked about making science based on merit. But my problem is, as someone who was in the academic system as a PhD neuroscientist, I wrote my first grant, got to NIMH. It wasn't reviewed, but they sent it back and said, well, can you make the data open source? I turned it around in 2 months and got a perfect score on my grant proposal from NIMH. But I wasn't on infant brain development. I wasn't allowed to ask about vaccines. My grant would have never been considered if I put in there what I really wanted to study. But my question is, how do we use this transparency, this focus on transparency, focus on discourse instead of retraction? So maybe we don't retract drugs. We're not doing that yet with mRNA vaccine, but we create an environment where we can have more discussion to then show the merit on the science, because I don't see that happening. Someone else's good science is someone else's bad science, and I need to better understand how I can do that as an independent researcher. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so those are great questions, and I think they tie into the last point where you talked about the patents and the IP, and I think that part of science, I mean, there's one issue regarding the financial incentives associated with it. The other issue is the justification for lack of transparency that often is brought upon, where we say, oh, we can't disclose this, there's IP rights. So I think there's a general issue about transparency in terms of these sorts of policies. When I talk about merit, I don't mean merit by what a study section at NIH. I mean, we need to think more with a lot of discipline and intent in terms of defining what we mean by merit. We have technology now in the form of AI, in the form of blockchain that could potentially give more open data kind of ideas. And I think implementing these, like for instance, I would imagine an AI eventually can get to a point of what is really original data. I think AI can do that much better than peer review probably can. And I'm not talking about AI that's trained on PubMed that's got biases associated. I'm talking about AI that's objectively assessing certain basic criteria. They could be criteria among scientists that disagree with one another, and there's a long conversation to be had there, but I think really figuring out what we mean by merit, how to define it, and how to get better ideas about what it is, I think is really important. And as much as I can talk about merit, is the underlying issue really is this transparency, and that's all it's really. I mean, whether it's these IP issues, whether it's how these universities are defining merit. I mean, it's merit largely right now is what the dean says is merit, and that is what's coming. What that historically came from what the NIH officials said was merit.
We reward on the incentives that we give, and so if our incentives are based on health outcomes, predefined health outcomes, we're going to reward on that. If it's on the amount of grant money that you bring in and that kind of thing, a number of publications, these are orthogonal to health outcomes. But I did want to address your informed consent point. Informed consent exists in two places: with your doctor for personal care, and then also during research. Since this is about research, I just want to remind everyone that every single vaccine that's on the market is studied for long-term safety using retrospective studies which involve human subjects. So every person that's ever been given a vaccine and wasn't told, you're entering into a long-term human subject research study on vaccine safety, has been denied informed consent. And every single vaccine manufacturer and doctor that administered a vaccine is in violation of 45 CFR 46 and the Common Rule, et cetera. So one of my initiatives, and it really didn't go anywhere, is I have a Universal Declaration of Medical Rights where it's a contract between you and your doctor. And it acknowledges that you're not being put on a clinical trial, that the doctor signs that you are not being put on a clinical trial. And it also, the first part of it says, I acknowledge that this is a full human being in front of me and that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. It's really a beautiful document. Then you enter into a contractual relationship with your doctor. If your doctor won't sign this document, turn around and walk out. That's the plan. Also, how is it universal? How do I know what all you want to say? It's universal because you can edit it. It's your contract with your doctor. We don't all have to walk lockstep. But informed consent is violated on a daily basis in doctors' offices, not just on vaccines, but on drugs as well. And there's a rule that went in at the last minute in the 21st Century Cures Act that allows your doctor to put you on a clinical trial without your knowledge if they have assessed that the risk to you is low. And I objected to it then, I objected to it now. We don't want that in our country. That needs to be updated. So there are things that can be done. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, firstly, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers today for taking the time to come talk to us on this very important topic. I also want to recognize the head of the MAHA Institute, Deborah Sheldon here, who is the visionary behind all of these roundtables that we do. And also want to recognize the MAHA Institute members, Justin, Noel, Bree, Maddie, that really facilitated this for us today. If you've got further questions, please email it to us. We'll be sure to pass that on to the panelists. As I sort of think about and reflect on today, it kind of dawned on me that the future of science is perhaps not going to be defined by better algorithms or better AI or bigger grants, but perhaps a return to something much more simpler, a return to honesty, transparency, the courage to publish something even though that's inconvenient, to maybe treat dissent as not as a threat, but as an engine for progress. But until then, if you hear a doctor or a researcher or a regulator say, follow the science, then we know that real science doesn't demand our trust. It's earned. And if we can lead the way in building that type of scientific culture, then we might be able to restore the trustworthiness of science, and in doing so, make America healthy again. Thank you very much.